My name is Jean Moreau, a simple infantryman of the French army, and before Verdun, I believed I understood what war meant. I had trained, marched, fired my rifle, and listened to officers speak of honor and duty. But none of that prepared me for the moment. Our train slowed near the Meuse River, and the word Verdun passed from mouth to mouth like a curse. Even before we disembarked, I sensed that this place was different. The air felt heavier, as if the land itself carried a memory of violence waiting to awaken. Veterans we passed along the tracks did not cheer or warn us. They simply stared with hollow eyes, and that silence frightened me more than any speech could have. We were stepping into what would later be known as the Battle of Verdun, though at that moment it was simply a destination on our orders, a name written in ink that would soon be written again in blood. Verdun was spoken of as a symbol, and symbols are dangerous things in war. Our officers told us that Verdun guarded the road to the heart of France, that it was a fortress city layered with history, walls, and pride. If it fell, they said, the nation itself would be wounded. I remember believing them, not because I fully understood strategy, but because I wanted my suffering to mean something. Among my comrades there was nervous laughter, forced bravado, and the quiet writing of letters that might never be sent. We were young, most of us, sons of farmers, clerks, and factory workers. Carrying rifles that felt heavier with every kilometer, we marched toward the front. The distant thunder we heard was not a storm. It was artillery, and with each dull boom, the illusion of adventure drained a little more from our faces. As we approached the sector, the landscape changed. Villages were reduced to broken stones. Trees stood shattered like matchsticks, and the roads were crowded with wagons, ambulances, and columns of men moving in opposite directions. Those walking away from the front looked older than their years, their uniforms caked with mud and something darker I did not want to name. No one spoke loudly. Orders were given in short, sharp commands, as if even words might draw enemy fire. When we finally reached the trenches assigned to us, the smell hit first. Wet earth, rot, smoke, and unwashed bodies trapped together for too long. This was not the France I knew. This was another world carved beneath the surface of it. That first night, I learned what waiting truly meant. Waiting for shells to fall, waiting for orders, waiting for dawn, waiting for death. I pressed my back against the trench wall and listened to the wind carry distant explosions across the dark. Each sound seemed closer than the last. My hands trembled, not from cold alone, but from the knowledge that somewhere beyond the darkness, an enemy waited just as nervously, just as human. I thought of my home, of my mother's kitchen, of ordinary sounds that now felt impossibly far away. Verdun had already begun to erase the man I had been, replacing him with someone harder, quieter, and more afraid. What struck me most was the sense that we were being swallowed by something immense and indifferent. Officers spoke of holding positions, of sectors and rotations, but from the trench it felt as though the land itself demanded sacrifice. We were told that German forces were gathering in unprecedented numbers, that their plan was not simply to take Verdun, but to bleed France white. At the time, those words sounded like exaggeration meant to steal our resolve. Only later would I understand how accurate they were. Verdun was not meant to be a swift battle. It was meant to be an endurance test, a place where survival itself became a form of resistance. As dawn approached, the sky lightened to a sickly gray, revealing a horizon scarred by smoke columns and ruined forts. I gripped my rifle and tried to steady my breathing. Around me, my comrades did the same, some whispering prayers, others staring silently ahead. No one spoke of glory anymore. In that moment, Verdun ceased to be a name or a symbol and became a reality that pressed against my chest with every breath. I realized then that whatever happened here would stay with us forever. We had not yet fired a shot, and already the battle had begun inside us. February 21st, 1916, is a date carved into my bones. At dawn, the air felt unnaturally still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the sky erupted. German artillery opened fire with a violence beyond anything we had imagined. The first shells struck far behind our lines. But within minutes, the bombardment crept forward like a living thing, crawling toward our trenches. The earth shook so violently that I lost my balance and slammed into the trench wall, my helmet ringing like a bell. The noise was constant, crushing, a single endless roar that swallowed all thought. Orders were impossible to hear. Men shouted, but their voices vanished instantly, torn apart by the thunder above us. Dirt, stones, and pieces of shattered wood rained down, filling our mouths and eyes, turning breathing into a struggle. I remember thinking that the sky itself had cracked open and was pouring death straight onto us. Shells exploded so close that the pressure slammed against my chest, knocking the air from my lungs. Each blast felt personal, as if it had chosen its victim and simply missed by chance. Some men were not so lucky. A direct hit erased the section of trench to my left, and where moments before there had been shouting and movement, there was suddenly nothing but a smoking crater. No bodies, no cries, just absence. It was then I understood that death at Verdun did not always come with pain or warning. Sometimes it came as erasure. Time lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours. Hours like an eternity. We crouched, helpless, clinging to the earth like insects while steel and fire passed judgment above us. Fear became something physical, a weight pressing down on my spine, forcing me lower and lower until my face was nearly in the mud. I was no longer thinking of France, honor, or even survival in any noble sense. I was thinking only of the next second, then the next. Between explosions, there were brief, terrifying silences. Moments when I dared to believe it was over, only for the bombardment to resume with renewed fury. Men cried openly. Others laughed hysterically. Some simply stared, eyes wide, mouths moving in silent prayers. The bombardment lasted for hours, though it felt like days, and by the time it finally lifted, Verdun had been transformed. The land was unrecognizable, churned into a broken wasteland of craters and smoke. And as the guns fell silent, we realized with dread that the shelling had only been the beginning. When the artillery finally eased, we learned that survival at Verdun did not mean safety, only continuation. The trenches became our entire world. Narrow scars cut into the earth where time stretched and twisted. Mud was everywhere, thick and clinging, swallowing boots and making every step an effort. Rain turned the floor into a foul soup of water, clay, blood, and decay. And when it dried, it hardened like cement around our legs. Sleep came in short, broken moments, always interrupted by flares, distant explosions, or the sudden shout of a sentry. Even in rest, the body never truly relaxed, as if it knew danger would return the moment we let our guard down. Rats were our constant companions, fat from feeding on the dead, running across our chests at night without fear. At first we tried to chase them away, but soon we stopped caring. There were worse things than rats in Verdun. The smell was something no training had prepared us for. It was a mix of rot, unwashed bodies, smoke, and the sweet, sickening scent of death that lingered no matter how much dirt we piled over fallen comrades. Sometimes bodies lay just beyond the trench, unreachable under enemy fire, slowly decomposing in the open. We stopped reacting to it because reacting required energy, and energy was something we could not afford to waste. Lice infested our uniforms, burrowing into seams and skin, leaving us scratching until we bled. Cleanliness became a memory, like peace. Letters from home arrived sporadically, carried by men who looked more like ghosts than soldiers. Reading them felt unreal, as if they described a different universe where life continued normally, untouched by the madness consuming us here. Fear settled into us like a second heartbeat. It was always there, even during the quiet hours, whispering that the next shell might be meant for you, that the next patrol might not return. We learned to read the sounds of war, to distinguish outgoing fire from incoming, to judge by instinct whether to duck or keep moving. New soldiers arrived wide-eyed and stiff with terror, and within days their expressions hardened, their movements slowing, as Verdun claimed another piece of them. Conversations became short and practical. Dreams disappeared. We lived from ration to ration, from shift to shift, measuring existence not in days but in survived bombardments. In those trenches, I realized that Verdun was not just killing men. It was stripping them down to something raw and essential, forcing us to confront how little separated life from death, and how thin the line was between courage and simple endurance. When the German infantry finally came, it felt almost unreal, as if after all that thunder and fire, the world had suddenly narrowed into something brutally simple. The bombardment lifted, and an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the distant groans of the wounded. We knew what that silence meant. Officers moved along the trench, shouting hoarse commands, and we climbed onto firing steps with hands numb and slick with sweat despite the cold. Then shapes began to emerge from the smoke, dark figures advancing steadily across the shattered ground. They moved with discipline, using shell holes for cover, their helmets glinting faintly when the light caught them. My training took over because my mind could not. I raised my rifle, aimed, and fired, again and again, the recoil jarring my shoulder until it went numb. Each shot felt detached, mechanical, as if someone else were pulling the trigger. The distance closed quickly. Machine guns rattled, stitching lines of death across the open ground, and men fell on both sides, some collapsing instantly, others crawling forward in desperate, futile attempts to continue. The noise was overwhelming but different from the artillery, sharper and more intimate. I could see faces now, strained and grim, not monsters but men no older than us. That realization made no difference. Bayonets were fixed, and when the first Germans reached the wire, the fight became chaos. Grenades exploded in flashes of dirt and smoke, bodies collided, and the trench filled with shouting, smoke, and fear. There was no room for thought, only reaction. I stabbed with my bayonet without knowing if it struck flesh or equipment, pushed forward because stopping meant dying. At one point, a German soldier leaped into the trench near me, his eyes wide with the same terror I felt. For a fraction of a second, we stared at each other, both frozen by the absurd closeness of it all. Then instinct took over, and one of us went down. I never knew which blow ended him, only that when it was over, he lay still at my feet. There was no triumph, only a hollow emptiness and a trembling in my hands that would not stop. The attack eventually faltered, the Germans pulling back under relentless fire, leaving the ground littered with bodies and shattered equipment. We had held, but the cost was written all around us in blood and silence. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion crashed down like a wave, and I understood that this was how Verdun would be fought. Meter by meter, man by man, until one side simply had nothing left to give. The news reached us not through official orders, but through whispers. Carried along the trench like a cold wind, Douaumont had fallen. At first I refused to believe it. Fort Douaumont was supposed to be the backbone of Verdun's defenses, a massive concrete guardian that had watched over the region for decades. We had been told it was nearly impregnable, a symbol of French military strength and engineering. To hear that it was now in German hands felt like a blow to the chest, stealing the breath from our already exhausted lungs. Men stopped what they were doing and simply stared at one another, searching for reassurance in familiar faces and finding none. If Douaumont could fall, what hope did the rest of us have in our muddy trenches with little more than rifles and faith holding us together? Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said the fort had been abandoned, others that it had been taken almost without a fight, and those stories hurt the most. The idea that such a powerful position could be lost so easily gnawed at our morale. Anger mixed with fear, not just toward the enemy, but toward the war itself, which seemed to mock all planning and preparation. We imagined German flags flying over the fort, imagined their guns now turned toward us, and every distant explosion felt like confirmation of our worst thoughts. Officers tried to calm us, insisting that forts could be retaken, that the battle was far from decided, but their words struggled to cut through the sense of doom that settled over us. The psychological impact was immediate. Men who had held themselves together through bombardment and attack now seemed brittle, their confidence cracked. Conversations turned darker, filled with questions no one could answer. Were we being sacrificed here? Was Verdun truly worth this endless slaughter? At night, as flares lit the sky, I found myself staring toward the direction of the fort, imagining the concrete corridors and dark chambers now occupied by the enemy. The thought that a place meant to protect us had become a weapon against us was almost unbearable. Yet even in despair, something stubborn refused to break. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps simple survival instinct, but the loss of Douaumont also ignited a quiet fury. If the Germans wanted Verdun, they would have to pay for every stone, every meter of ground. The fort's fall did not end our resistance, it hardened it. We dug deeper, reinforced our positions, and clenched our teeth against the fear. Verdun was bleeding, yes, but we were still standing, and as long as we stood, the battle was not over. The arrival of General Pétain marked a subtle but powerful shift, one we felt more than we heard. His words traveled down the lines, not as grand speeches, but as a simple, relentless promise. They shall not pass. Those words spread through the trenches like a spark catching dry grass. Not because they erased our fear, but because they gave it direction. We were no longer merely enduring the storm. We were holding a line that must not break. Pétain reorganized the defense, rotated units so no one stayed too long in the front, and for the first time in weeks it felt as though someone understood that men were not infinite resources. Supplies began to arrive more reliably, ammunition stacked higher in dugouts, and even the wounded were evacuated with greater urgency. These changes did not make Verdun less deadly, but they made survival feel possible again, and that mattered more than any medal. The phrase "they shall not pass" echoed in my head during every bombardment and every attack. It was not shouted in triumph. It was muttered through clenched teeth while reloading a rifle with shaking hands. It became a shield for the mind, something to cling to when logic said retreat would be the only sane choice. We were no longer fighting for abstract strategy maps or distant politicians. We were fighting because turning back felt worse than standing our ground. The enemy could take forts, hills, and trenches, but they would not take our will without paying an unbearable price. Morale, fragile as glass, slowly reformed into something harder. Men who had been silent for days began to speak again, sharing cigarettes, crude jokes, and memories of home. These small human acts felt like defiance in a place designed to erase humanity. Even fear changed its shape. It was still there, always there, but it no longer paralyzed us. Instead, it sharpened our senses, made us faster, more alert, more stubborn. We learned that courage at Verdun was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand, despite it. Each time the Germans attacked and were thrown back, even at terrible cost, the words gained weight. "They shall not pass" was no longer just an order. It was a shared oath between exhausted men who understood that victory might not look like triumph, but survival itself could be a form of victory. Verdun had become a test of endurance, and under Pétain's command, we began to believe that as long as we could endure, France would endure with us. What kept Verdun alive was not only rifles and resolve, but a single artery of movement that pulsed day and night behind the lines. The road we came to call the Voice. To us, it was more than a supply route. It was proof that France had not abandoned us. Trucks rolled endlessly along it, their engines growling through mud and shell dust, carrying ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fresh troops toward the front, then returning loaded with wounded men whose faces told stories we did not dare ask about. The road never slept. Even under enemy fire, and in the worst weather, it kept moving, as if stopping would mean surrender. Watching those convoys pass filled me with a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that help was coming, guilt that others were being sent to take our place in the line of fire. The drivers became legends in our conversations. Men who navigated shell holes and wreckage with nerves of steel, knowing that a single hit could turn their truck into a burning coffin. We saluted them whenever we could, not out of regulation but respect. Without them, our rifles would have fallen silent, our stomachs empty, our wounded left to die. Each crate of shells unloaded into the trenches felt like borrowed time, another chance to hold on. When rations arrived, hard bread and thin soup, we ate them like feasts, because they carried the taste of continuity. Of a nation still functioning beyond the chaos of Verdun, rotations also began to matter more. Men who had spent weeks in the front were pulled back, replaced by others, then sent again after a brief rest. No one truly escaped Verdun, but these movements kept us from collapsing entirely. I remember the shock of stepping away from the front for a short time. The silence feeling unnatural, almost threatening in its calm. Even then, the distant rumble of guns never fully faded. A reminder that the battle waited patiently for our return. The sacred road changed how we thought about endurance. We realized we were part of something vast, a collective effort stretching far beyond our trenches. Civilians, mechanics, drivers, medics, and factory workers were all bound to us by that road. Knowing this did not lessen the danger, but it gave meaning to our suffering. Each time I watched another convoy disappear, toward the front, I understood that Verdun was not held by a single heroic moment, but by countless ordinary acts repeated without pause, until exhaustion itself became a weapon we wielded against the enemy. As spring turned into summer and summer bled into autumn, Verdun refused to end. The battle stretched on until time itself seemed wounded. Days melting into one another until only the rhythm of survival remained. We stopped marking calendars because dates had no meaning here. Only bombardments, attacks, and brief fragile pauses defined our existence. The landscape grew more unrecognizable with each passing week. Hills were flattened, forests erased, and familiar landmarks vanished beneath layers of churned earth and shattered metal. Even the air felt different, heavy with smoke and decay, so thick at times that breathing felt like an act of defiance. Verdun was no longer a place on a map, but a condition of life, an endless present filled with noise and waiting. Fatigue became our most relentless enemy. It seeped into muscles and minds alike, dulling reactions and turning simple tasks into struggles. Men fell asleep standing, woke screaming from dreams they could not escape, or stared blankly at nothing for hours until shaken back to awareness. Shell shock was spoken of in whispers, as if naming it might summon it, but we all recognized the signs. Hands that would not stop trembling, eyes that flinched at every sound, voices that cracked under the weight of constant fear. Some were sent away, others stayed because there was no one left to replace them. In Verdun, breaking was not a personal failure, it was an occupational hazard. Despite everything, the fighting never truly stopped. Attacks were launched, repelled, and launched again. Often for ground so devastated it held no strategic value beyond the fact that someone else wanted it. We advanced a few meters, lost them the next day, then bled to regain them again. Each gain was measured not in triumph, but in bodies. The dead lay everywhere, sometimes buried hastily, sometimes left where they fell because retrieving them meant inviting death. Eventually, they became part of the landscape. Grim markers of how long this battle had been consuming us. Yet even in this prolonged hell, a strange numbness set in. Horror lost its sharpness through repetition, replaced by a quiet resignation. We learned to function amid destruction, to joke darkly about our chances, to share cigarettes beside craters that had once been homes. This numbness was not peace, but it was survival. Verdun did not end quickly because it was never meant to. It was designed to grind us down, to exhaust our bodies and spirits, until nothing remained. The fact that we were still there, still resisting after months of relentless suffering, became our answer to that design. A stubborn refusal to disappear. By the time autumn deepened into late 1916, something slowly began to change, not suddenly or dramatically, but with the quiet persistence that had come to define Verdun itself. Orders reached us that we would no longer only endure and resist, but push back. The word counteroffensive passed through the ranks with cautious disbelief. After months of losing and regaining the same shattered ground, the idea of advancing felt almost unreal, as if it belonged to another war entirely. Yet preparations were different this time. Artillery was coordinated with precision we had not seen before, barrages timed to lift just ahead of our movement, giving us a narrow window to advance rather than be cut down in the open. For the first time in a long while, it felt as though planning was working in our favor. When we went forward, it was not with excitement, but with grim focus. We advanced through terrain that barely resembled Earth anymore, stepping over debris, twisted metal, and the remains of men from both sides. Every meter gained felt heavy, as if the ground itself resisted being taken again. German positions, once so dominant, now showed signs of strain. Their fire was still deadly, but less relentless. their counterattacks less coordinated. We could sense that they too were exhausted, bled by the same merciless logic that had consumed us. Verdun had become a shared nightmare, and now it was beginning to devour those who had started it. The retaking of key positions, including the areas around Douaumont, carried a different emotion than I had expected. There was no joy, no surge of triumph, only a deep, weary relief. Standing on ground that had cost so many lives, I felt nothing resembling victory. Instead, there was a crushing awareness of what it had taken to reach this moment. We fought with the knowledge that each step forward was paid for by men who would never see the end of the battle, let alone the end of the war. As French flags replaced German ones, the meaning of success shifted. Winning at Verdun did not mean breaking the enemy completely. It meant proving that they could not break us. The counteroffensive did not erase the suffering of the previous months, nor did it heal the wounds etched into our bodies and minds. But it did something just as important. It showed that endurance could turn into momentum, that holding on long enough could exhaust even the strongest assault. In that realization, quiet and understated, Verdun began to move toward its end. When the guns finally fell silent, toward the end of 1916, the quiet felt unreal, almost threatening, as if the earth itself was unsure whether it was allowed to rest. Verdun did not end with a clear moment of celebration or a single decisive victory. It simply faded, like a storm that had exhausted itself after tearing everything apart. We remained in our positions, listening to the absence of explosions, waiting for the next shell that did not come. Only slowly did we understand that it was truly over, that the longest and bloodiest battle we would ever know had released its grip on us. Yet survival did not feel like triumph. It felt like standing among ruins and realizing that something essential had been taken and could never be returned. Walking through the battlefield after the fighting stopped was harder than any attack. The land was unrecognizable, a vast cemetery without proper graves. Craters overlapped craters, forests were reduced to blackened stumps, and bones surfaced from the mud after every rain. Verdun had consumed villages, hills, and men with equal indifference. I searched for familiar landmarks and found none, only memories tied to places that no longer existed. Many of the friends I had arrived with were gone, their names spoken softly or not at all, as if silence could spare us further pain. I carried their absence with me, a weight heavier than any pack I had worn. The meaning of Verdun followed me long after I left its trenches. To the nation, it became a symbol of resistance and sacrifice, proof that France could endure the worst and still stand. To those of us who fought there, it was something far more intimate and painful. Verdun taught us that war was not glory or heroism, but attrition, patience, and loss measured in human lives. It showed us the limits of the body and the frightening resilience of the mind when pushed beyond those limits. We did not feel like heroes, we felt like witnesses to something that should never be repeated. Even now, I know that part of me never truly left Verdun. It remains in the mud of the trenches, in the echoes of artillery that sometimes return in my dreams, in the faces of men frozen at the moment history consumed them. We held Verdun, and, in doing so, we helped save France. But the price was written into our generation forever. Verdun did not just mark the land, it marked us, reminding the world that endurance can win battles, but it always leaves scars that no silence can fully heal.